So connected healthcare, I mean, it's a broad topic. And I work for Bupa. I'm a medical director for Bupa UK. And we're a healthcare company, and we have both provisions. So we have clinics, hospitals, dentists, and opticians. But we're also an insurer, and we insure patients with private healthcare. And that's delivered in a series of hospitals across the UK. But our insurance products only cover a small proportion of a patient's whole care journey. So we only offer predominantly secondary care. So when they go into the hospital, we refund them for that journey. And it means that we only have access to a small bit of data in that part of our business. And so it's very fragmented, and we don't really understand the health of our patients. And what I would like to see is us becoming more connecting with our primary care colleagues, with our social care, in order to understand our patients a bit better so that we can prevent them from coming into hospital in the first place. So really that's why connected healthcare is important for me. It's about us linking up with our colleagues across the patient pathway in order to be able to deliver better patient care for our customers. So with me today, we have 4 panelists. Tom Van Eerie, who is the Executive Director of Hive Innovation at ViiV Healthcare. We have Nicola Perrin, who's the Head of Policy at the Wellcome Trust. We have Ian Buchan, who's the Professor of Health Informatics at the University of Manchester. And we have Matthew Bonham, who's the Director of Intelligent Pharmaceuticals at AstraZeneca. And I think the areas that we're going to cover today are a little bit around what connected healthcare means for our panelists and why it's important for their organizations. Something around, and I think when we talk about connected healthcare, we are going to talk about data, because data is what will connect us, I think, as well as other sort of levers. And when we think about data, what is it about data that can enable us to be more connected? Who should be holding that data? And how can we encourage patients to facilitate more connected data sharing across these organizations? And we heard some interesting perspectives earlier about patients being worried about sharing genetics data, or the NHS being the trusted body to house data. And so we'll touch on that a little bit. And we're also going to talk a little bit about how organizations like AstraZeneca need to kind of demonstrate the value of developing products that are outside of the actual, just the pill, and are involved in connecting the wider healthcare ecosystem. So without further ado, I'll just to each panelist, starting with Tom, it'd be great if you could say a little bit about your background and tell us why connected healthcare, what it means to you, and why it's important for your organization.
Sure, okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tom Van Eerie, as Lizzie said, and I run the innovation unit for ViiV Healthcare, which is a pharmaceutical company focused on HIV, and it's a partnership between Pfizer, GSK, and Shionogi. And my background is I'm a medical doctor by training and a healthcare tech entrepreneur. I've had a couple of businesses in this area. And at the innovation unit in ViiV Healthcare, we're very much looking at what connected healthcare can do for our patients, mainly on the service side. So this is not drug innovation, this is service development innovation. And when I think of connected healthcare, I think of it very much being in terms of how can we turn the traditional doctor-patient binary visit, which allows the doctor and the patient to discuss their problems and the doctor to treat or diagnose based on what the patient happens to remember in the 5 minutes that he or she speaks to the doctor, moving that from that kind of binary event to a more continuous monitoring of patients. So we get, as healthcare provision expands, to a much broader, continuous, more realistic view of what the patient's experience of their illness is, patient's experience of the treatment that we might provide for them, and their general health care. So it's a much broader journey that we're going on. And that has a lot of value for general reasons, but also specific reasons for ViiV Healthcare. So in general reasons, we know chronic disease is becoming more important. The burden of chronic disease in any healthcare system is increasing with diabetes, COPD, high cholesterol, high blood pressure. There's a whole range of them. And I don't think it's going to be useful in the long run to just manage those patients based on a quick conversation between the provider and the patient, because there's a lot going on. In HIV in particular, which is the focus of ViiV, the management of HIV has evolved from trying to save people's lives and keep them alive for as long as possible into the management of a chronic disease. So the treatments for HIV are very effective. And with that has become this need to see the patient as more than just the viral load, their infectivity with the virus, the state of their immune system, their CD4 count, and much more about their view of what constitutes appropriate care and how they're affected by their illness. And we call that the outcomes revolution, if you like, moving it from very specific clinical data that might be of interest to the doctor to much broader data that may be of interest to the patient, the doctor, the provider, the policymaker, the payer, and companies like ours. So that's the kind of broader context, and we can maybe come back to how we address some of the challenges that creates.
Thank you, Tom. Nicola.
So the Wellcome Trust is a global charitable foundation that aims to improve human health. We fund about £1 billion a year of research, but also not just pure biomedical research. We fund medical humanities and public engagement work to try and put science into its cultural context and ensure public confidence in the uptake of the research that we fund. So the policy team first came to these kind of issues because of the importance of opening up access to health data for researchers, because of the vast potential of research if we could connect up data across the NHS. And it quickly became clear to us that, yes, there were issues with researchers accessing the data because of specific governance processes, but the most important thing was that the public, patients, healthcare professionals all need to have confidence in the way data is stored, collected, managed and used across the NHS. And until we have that trust, it's very difficult to make the most of data across the NHS. So to us, or to me, connected healthcare means two things. It's about joining up data better in order to provide better care for an individual, so that your own individual care pathway, but it's also about making better connections to improve health care and services across the whole of the NHS. And that's where one needs other users to come in. You need commercial access, you need academics to be able to access the data, you need charities to be able to access the data in an appropriate framework. And that will only be possible, as I say, if we have the trust. But at the moment, people's understanding of how their data is used within the NHS is incredibly low. Wellcome commissioned a report which was published earlier this year looking at public attitudes to commercial access to data, which we can discuss in more detail today. But the overarching finding was just how low people's understanding is of what happens to their data at the moment, even for their own individual care. So only a third of people felt that they knew what happened to their patient records within the NHS. And the idea of academics using data or commercial companies accessing the data, only 16-17% of people were even really aware that that was happening. So we need to get much, much better at having open and honest conversations with people about why data is needed, how it's used, what the safeguards are in place, what the benefits to them as individuals are, and how we can make the most of the connections across the system. And I think that will become even more important with new digital technologies delivering healthcare and so really disrupting the way we provide healthcare with increasing use of wearables, of apps, of telemedicine, telehealth. And there are huge data sets that will be collected there, and we need to make sure that we're on the front foot on public confidence so we can make the most of them.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nicola. I just want to reinforce Nicola's point about public confidence and transparency. And I wear this badge deliberately. Data saves lives, hashtag. It's gone viral on Twitter. You can look it up. People ask me on public transport, what's that all about? And I say it's about making data work for citizens rather than citizens work for data. If data are properly working for patients and the public, then we will achieve measurable connected care. So the right care to the right patient at the right time, in the right way for the individual patient and for the community with very scarce healthcare resources that have to be targeted extremely carefully. As more data become available, the analytic challenge grows. So I have a team at the University of Manchester of around 70 people, of a third biomedical public health, a third software engineering, a third analytic, math, stats. And across 18 universities, I work as one of the directors of the Pharma Institute, trying to network these very scarce and complex resource of humans able to reason across very complex data with public trust for discovery science. But the other big part of our work, not just discovery science, not just pulling in data to the equivalent of the discovery arm of pharma, is the development arm for data that deliver something, that generates public trust. We must give something back. So that's our actionable analytics theme. And it's the unexpected item in the bagging area of a medical school. It's a group of engineers who are able to turn data into actionable insights and then follow through. If you feed back some heads up, there's a group of patients who seem to have an unusual journey of care, off the care pathway. Might there be something you want to do differently? What we do with this Data Saves Lives program is to take the problems and the questions and let go of them, give them to members of the public and patients, and say, do you care about these? Overwhelmingly, yes. Many of our public involvement groups and citizens' juries grab certain questions and say, we thought you were doing that. We want to check back in 6 months' time to see that you are doing it. So pulling through the data uses from the communities who will benefit from feedback of those data, whether that be investments in jobs and prosperity from a pharma company doing a big real-world study, or whether that be real-time medication safety surveillance for better primary care. The public voice in that loop with data is very powerful.
So I'm Matt Bonham. I am part of what is essentially AstraZeneca's digital health organisation. And we were set up about 4 years ago to really couple our medications with digital health tools. So that's things like sensor technologies, medical devices, particularly behavioural science interventions. All designed to then support better outcomes for patients. We've kind of been through a bit of a journey in the 4 years, and it's worth starting off saying that we were actually set up with a very simple question, which was the wrong question, which is how can you get patients to take more medication, essentially. And I think there's probably a lot of groups within pharma companies set up in exactly the same way. So I'm going to steal Ian's words, because we went back very quickly and said that's the wrong question. There absolutely is an element of making sure that the right patient is receiving the right therapy at the right dose at the right time. And that's a really important thing. But it also has to sit within an ecosystem of the right care for that patient and the right support. And by doing those things, you can have a real impact on individual patient outcomes and overall cost of care for a population. But I think the real beauty of this is, and I think there'll probably be a discussion later about whether you can actually trust pharma to do any of this. So I'll get my shot in first and say, of course you can. But there's an element of the data that you can collect from really high quality services like the ones that we're hopefully delivering, coupled with the company's knowledge of their therapy and the data that's been generated right the way through from discovery through all of the phases of clinical development, then coupled with the data that's there within the community, can actually really help to identify and phenotype individual patients and help that patient and their care provider understand their individual risk and take the right actions. And I think that's where the real beauty of this can lie.
Thanks, Matt. And in speaking to the panel earlier, that we've heard the tagline "Data saves lives," but I also heard the tagline "Data is dangerous." And I just wanted a show of hands. Who in the audience thinks data is dangerous? quite a few. And who in the audience thinks data saves lives? Overwhelming majority. And I just wanted the panel to comment, perhaps Matt first, talking a bit about which one do you feel and why?
So I wouldn't be doing the job I was doing if I didn't think data saved lives. However, there are perceptions both within industry and within the wider society that data is dangerous. So people are very worried about sharing genetic information because they think their insurer will use it. That's, yeah. I'll take Nicola as the expert on this, but that's certainly the perception I have. People don't really trust either Google or Apple or pharma companies, and so they worry about who's actually got access to that data and exactly how it's going to be used. And so I think we've done a very bad job of selling why data is important and helping people to understand what we can do with it and having the discussion, and so that makes it dangerous. I think there's also, you know, so in the UK, I think probably 2 weekends ago, lots of Tesco bank customers lost lots of money, at least for a short time, because people were able to hack a system and access data and information. And people are concerned, probably quite rightly, about things that are very private and personal and the potential for that being lost. So data, I wouldn't go so far as to say data is dangerous, but I would certainly go as far as saying data is difficult and that we need to make sure that we handle it very carefully to deliver what Ian's objective is, which is about data saving lives.
I would agree with the sentiments, I think, behind those lines of extreme, and qualify it on danger, acknowledging public concern, and say the data misused or data not used when people can benefit is a dangerous position. It's almost a negligent position. To build the public trust, to get that social license, I think you need a framework of transparency and accountability. I took a risk of accepting a position in Greater Manchester's devolution for 2.7 million people. There's an extreme data integration program in Greater Manchester, which is internationally interesting in my research field. But I was asked if I'd be director of civic analytics, and examples like, how do we invest in public transport to maximize the benefit of increasing physical activity alongside paying for SGLT2 inhibitors? How do you convolve those for the best medication outcome? There are all sorts of interesting questions coming from research side, but from public-facing side, there was the accountability question in my mind. How could you offer yourself up to be accountable and say, I am doing what I say? So there's a new bylaw in Greater Manchester of a duty to share data, a duty on behalf of the agencies offering public services, public and private agencies with contracts with public services, to share data if it's in the public interest to do so. So no withholding data saying I'm protecting citizens, when in reality that's a specious reason. You're not. You just don't want to lose power, control and influence. We want that value chain. We want a supply chain, a very transparent analytic to be there. But we realize that there needs to be an accountability framework. So that bylaw is accountable to the mayor. There will be an elected mayor in April. So citizens can sack the person in charge if they don't like what's done with the data. The ultimate accountability framework there is to elected members for a defined population with a 98% internal health economy. And that really acknowledges why I think it's very important to respect concern over potential dangers of misuse, but to be in there saying, here are the benefits that we need to talk about with a balanced argument.
And perhaps, there is a role for payors in that, explaining how some of our actuarial processes work, what information we already use, because we do use a lot of information, probably more than most patients think. So perhaps payors being more open about the sorts of considerations. Certainly when we're pricing health plans for big companies, obviously the risk is pooled into a big population, but for individuals there is always that concern that something like a genetic test or a genome might reveal something that will put the price of their insurance plan up. And perhaps being more open and transparent about how we price products will help to alleviate some of those concerns. But Nicola, I know this is your area of research, and you've produced a fantastic report which has some real insights. Will you share some of those findings with the audience, and then maybe we can get the audience to comment, particularly those that were, to see whether the perceptions that you found match the kind of concerns that some people said, expressed?
So I think the main finding was that people's views are much more complicated than we necessarily expected. So we did a large piece of both qualitative and quantitative analysis of public attitudes to commercial access to health data. We looked at a wide range of different reasons why companies might want to access data. So it was ranging from an analytics company working in partnership with the NHS to work out how to target services better, through to a pharmacy accessing summary care records. We had an insurance company, we had marketing company, we had drug development as well, and a whole sort of series of different uses. The main overarching finding was that it really depended why the data was being used. Although I think in previous studies there'd been this kind of knee-jerk commercial access is bad, when you actually give the examples and discuss it in more detail, it wasn't always bad. It depended why, and people asked a series of questions: why the data was accessed, who it was accessed by, how it was accessed, and what data was accessed. But the overarching question was the why, and that purpose was the most important thing. And if there was a public benefit, people were broadly comfortable with companies accessing data, provided there was a social public benefit. When we looked more at the concerns about companies having access and sort of asked people to unpack in a bit more detail what their concerns were, they really separated out into two main categories. One was this feeling of lack of control, third parties having the data, you're giving it to somebody and they'll pass it on to somebody else. And that was the sort of concern about direct-to-consumer marketing and sort of being targeted. And the really interesting thing on that is that for most of us, when we get a diagnosis of anything, the first thing we do is go to Google, type in our condition, and see what we find out. You then immediately are getting marketing as a result of what you've just searched for. People don't think about that. There's a benefit to them, so they understand, but there's also people aren't really making that connection and realizing how information they provide is being used. You also are more likely to pick up, you could have sort of flyers sent to you all the time about hearing aids. They've been coming, I get them regularly in the post, but it would only be if I actually had a problem with deafness or a family member did that, I would suddenly notice it and think, why are they targeting me? Somebody must have passed on my information. So often it's coincidental, but you only really realise when it appears to be targeted. So that kind of thing, there is a feeling that it's happening when actually it probably isn't. But so one of the elements of concern is lack of control. The other main one is much more of a social concern about vulnerable groups. This will be dangerous to society, and insurance is the one that I fear really falls into that category. And across all the purposes, insurance was the one that there really was a red line on. Marketing, mainly, but it depended on the example. So you could talk about margarine to lower cholesterol, and actually that was seen to have a bit of a health benefit, so maybe it wouldn't be quite such a bad thing. But insurance was pretty much a no-go.
Well, it's interesting because actually a very small percentage of the UK, if this is a UK study, have private medical insurance. I mean, maybe the data can be used in life insurance. Perhaps that's more common. But it's only a very small percent that are actually covered. So it's interesting that it's such a concern for people.
And also, that was even with anonymised or de-identified data being used by insurance companies, whereas actually people are consenting for their identifiable information to be used by insurance companies just to get life insurance. So things that will actually have much more impact on them is okay. You don't get much choice, you have to consent. But so it comes back to, as you were saying, that there's a lack of understanding of how insurance companies use information and why.
And it's interesting that what hasn't come across is the kind of industry fear, the pharmaceutical industry fear that patients don't trust them with their data. Or that, I mean, we heard in the panel earlier that I think the panel felt that the NHS was the right body because insurers weren't trusted with information. Did that come across at all in the study, or was that not?
Yeah, people felt that their data, they trusted the NHS much more, and so they felt their data would be safer in an NHS organisation than a company. In some of the focus groups, you then had people pushing back on that and saying, but actually, if you look at financial data, some of the systems that banks have got is clearly much stronger and much safer. And we know what happens in the NHS with paper records, so is it really safer? But the knee-jerk reaction is that NHS is a trustworthy institution and they will look after data safely.
Thank you.
Rightly or wrongly.
Thank you. So I guess firstly, I agree with everything the panel said, but I'm going to comment on it more from a clinical decision making, because I think that's where I, in my own mind, focus on connected healthcare. And I guess in thinking about that, it's both data saves lives, but also it is dangerous. Now, I'll elaborate on two of those things. So from a clinical perspective and decision making, healthcare is at the moment very much what I would say a bobber job. So you go and see your doctor, and the doctor, depending on how the doctor feels, how late they are, whether they had a bad night's sleep, what they can remember, you get a kind of proxy for good care, and the variability is quite large across the care you get. I think big data, the processing of that big data, can minimize that variability, and I think actually improve care. And that's particularly pertinent, I think, because if we look to where care is going in the world, with increasing chronic disease, the challenge for more patients is not the intuitive skill of the doctor to make a diagnosis, which I think is very hard to replicate as a machine learning as a computer, but it's much more managing their own disease, a kind of air traffic control system, so that the patient can navigate through their problem and through the healthcare system. And that, I think, plays very strongly to a big data-driven automated system. And while I accept people don't trust Google for everything, actually just the sort of intelligence that drives that sort of thing is just the sort of thing that could manage a patient through something that doesn't require the intuitive skill of the doctor. So I think data can really not only save lives, but improve the lives of a lot of people in clinical outcomes. I think where it's dangerous is actually maybe more for the doctor, because that role of the doctor being a bobber job expert, when actually we need them more to be intuitively skilled at the diagnosis, means they're getting relegated. So that's a stakeholder group that I think you'll see pushing back a lot on this kind of data in connectivity, firstly because of the role it demotes them to in that particular function, but also, and I think this is why a lot of wearables, technology, and these sorts of things struggle in healthcare, it requires a change in the doctor and the provider's workflow to incorporate what this big data is telling them. You know, if your structure is to see a patient in a clinic in 20 minutes or 15 minutes, you don't have the facility and the capability to suddenly change that into an air traffic controller managing 100 patients as and when the data needs to be acted upon. So until that kind of jump occurs, it's going to be dangerous, if you like, for doctors and hard for technology to reach that air traffic control role.
So that's a really interesting perspective, Tom. So you see clinicians or healthcare professionals delivering care in a kind of remote setting using devices and technology to feed information on certain, indexes or measures, and then interacting with the community if the blood pressure goes up or if the heart rate goes up, rather than the traditional medical model where a patient comes in to your clinic. So
That's right, exactly.
Enabling you to manage a much broader population, perhaps pick up on things before they actually turn into a medical issue.
Exactly, and I think, I mean, just to be clear, I'm not having doctors, I'm one myself. What I'm saying is the intuitive skill of the doctor is best used trying to uncover new things, not managing the patient through a system where the diagnosis is known. And a lot of healthcare inefficiency comes from it being very provider-orientated. So the patient, regardless of their problem, does the same journey, whereas I think a lot of that could be automated, delegated, even to the extent that the doctor doesn't have to get involved at all. And that, I think, also plays to the patient, an informed patient, being able to make their own decisions within the confines of some care guidelines.
Well, one of the benefits of connected healthcare and properly sharing data sets across all of the parts of the health ecosystem is that we'll be able to predict earlier or potentially design pathways or programs like behavioral change programs where we prevent disease from happening in the first place. And I know, Ian, you've worked on a few projects that that are looking at how you can use data to actually not just tell people what's happening, but then tell people what to do about what's happening. And I know that, Matt, you've been involved in some practical examples of using behavioural change in some of the initiatives that you've been working on. And I think, Tom, some of the stuff that you've been working on as well is similar. Would you be able to comment on those initiatives?
Sure. Yeah.
Ian?
Certainly. So it brings me to the title of this conference, really, Pharma Integrates, and integrates with what? Now, I see pharma integrating with hospitals around the world, with high-resolution information at expensive end-of-life care, and health systems struggling to intervene earlier in timely ways and ever more specific ways. But beyond specific, that is down to a particular genetic polymorphism and an incremental improvement to medication at the point of prescription, moving away from the infrequent intervention of the air traffic controller or this pilot-co-pilot role of patient and clinician, policy and prescription through to connected medication. But that convolved with other forms of intervention is the system view. And for me, Pharma Integrates should be Pharma Integrates with health systems. To fully understand health systems takes a very, very joined up piece of work. And just give you one simple example. So we've been studying medication behaviors and symptom self-awareness for people with schizophrenia, looking at the problem of relapse in schizophrenia when our in-precision medicine approach is a 6-weekly visit from a community psychiatric nurse, and many people in that interval will relapse. So how can we intervene in a more timely way? The first learning was that initial reactions to patients would not take up a smartphone application was completely incorrect. As soon as we brought service users, patients into the design lab and started to design an app that was about giving more self-control and self-awareness, seeing a change over time in symptoms instead of just feeding the beast. You know, you fill in a questionnaire and it goes into this black box of the NHS, and you suddenly, you're not part of that insight path. So you're not part then of the intervention path. When we created an instrument that went from the infrequent view of the clinic, and the cost constraint where you cannot simply afford in health systems to follow up more frequently for everybody, to creating a properly validated psychometric instrument that first gave the individual the heads up that they might be declining in the symptoms, they might be going off the medicines. Is it time to call for help? That was extremely popular with those involved, and more than 80% of those in the trials persisted with that app. So that was one piece of the involvement. Now they've come back and said, okay, there are sensitive areas, but we would like some new insights. We've been brainstorming. You know, there's a forward-facing camera there. If I'm frowning while I'm filling in a questionnaire, it might be another insight that something's not quite awry when I'm normally got a blank expression or I'm smiling. If I haven't done my usual activity and the position and motion sensing that's on the phone that runs the app says, I normally go swimming twice a week and I've suddenly stopped. It's another clue. So you're starting to get a bigger picture of someone's health behaviors and care in ways that could be quite disclosive and personal and intrusive. But as soon as you pull that into problem solving of relapse of schizophrenia, and you have driven by those trying to manage their conditions, it becomes an innovation hotspot, but it has to be system-wide and not for a provider organisation.
Add a few things to that. So we're just going to spend the session trying to agree with each other, I think. So I think the starting point for a lot of people when they started to move into, or companies when they moved into connected health, was almost step one, your current system's broken, so we'll have to redesign your system before we start. And that really didn't go very well at all for companies who tried and then closed those units down. So I think, building though, I think on what Ian was saying, job one really in the development of these kinds of tools is working out what's important to the patient and what's important to their physician. And strangely enough, that's not the same thing that's important to a pharmaceutical company. And actually, very often the thing that's important to the patient is not the same thing that's important to the physician either. And so, we've had a set of programs across cardiovascular diseases, respiratory conditions, and actually into cancer therapies as well, where you're able to do things like starting to give indications of potential relapse, which can be very, very powerful to the patient. But it's understanding what that patient actually wants from the solution. It's also absolutely the case that what the physician doesn't want is more data. They've already got so much of that and so much liability, at least globally, on that's a really difficult area to go. And I think to Tom's point of there is a need for a kind of a system change to really truly embed connected health, and I don't think that's going to happen quickly. And I think actually helping patients to self-manage using these technologies is an adequate stepping stone, because what it allows then is to give patients the knowledge and the power really to triage themselves. So if they're going along nicely, all of the data looks really good, everything is normal, and they're getting that feedback and the reassurance and the confidence that comes from that. It also provides the patient with the confidence to say, today's not a normal day. This looks very different. I'm being told, and I can see it looks very different. This is the time to talk to a physician now. And it also allows, as Tom said in his introduction, a much more fruitful conversation, because it's not about what I can remember about how I feel today. It's about having a record that says, actually, today or the last week has been different. Things are going wrong. Now can you help me, please? And I think that's so for me, at the moment at least, digital health and connected health is about patient empowerment more than anything else.
It's interesting. I mean, we heard earlier how many apps and gadgets there are out there, and one of the challenges is that patients input their data for a bit, and then maybe they get bored or they forget. Just like was it Matt put on the chairing the panel before, forgot to take his medication. Patients don't remember to then put in their heart rate or their extra information into their app. And Tom was describing, actually, in our discussion earlier, some interesting initiatives where they're looking at technologies that can take the data passively. And I think that is the future, where we're monitoring or helping patients self-manage, but not actually ask them to do a load of extra tasks. Tom, would you comment on that and maybe say a bit about some of the initiatives?
Yes, so I guess the point you made is absolutely right. If we think of adherence, for example, the sort of people who are adherent already are the sort of people who take the trouble to keep a diary every day and note things, and you end up targeting the group you don't really need to target, whereas the poorly adherent person, for the same reason they might be poorly adherent, is less likely to spend time filling something in every day and keeping a record. So it's certainly my observation that if we can move to more passive tracking of patients in a way that's transparent and addresses some of the data concerns which we've heard already, I think that may be helpful in a lot of cases. So if I can just contextualize that for HIV, for example, so HIV comes with a fair amount of social stigma, as you can imagine, and a lot of anxiety, mental illness, and depression. And when patients are in a particularly bad way, they may stop taking their medicines, and that's obviously bad for everybody, pretty much. Certainly bad for the patient if they're not controlled with their HIV, they become more infective, and may pass that on to somebody else, which is bad for the payer or the government who's paying for it. And from our perspective, it's bad for the pharma company. Patients not taking our medicines, and if they are not getting good outcomes, that doesn't look good for us either. So at the same time, these sorts of patients have pretty chaotic lives. The HIV is maybe the less or least relevant part of their life. If they're homeless, or if they're having poor relationships, they're living undercover, if you like, and are not getting on, they don't have a family network, if they've been ostracized. So we are exploring ways to passively monitor and predict whether patients are wobbling. And some of the ways we've been experimenting with are the kind of fairly obvious ones of looking at sleep patterns, putting on a Fitbit or monitoring on your phone and seeing how people behave and whether that predicts their viral load or how well they're controlled and that sort of thing. But you can take it a step further. So we're also looking at, there's a company that will monitor the tone of voice of someone on the phone 50 times a second and will come up with if you like, a predictive score of their mental state based on their tone of voice. Now that has some, that's pretty exciting. It also has some challenges because if you're an HIV positive patient and there are many HIV positive patients who have a kind of conspiracy theory about where their HIV came from, and the pharmaceutical industry is promoting HIV to provide treatments. Being monitored every time you speak plays straight into that conspiracy theory. But just to be clear, the system doesn't understand what you're saying. It's just listening to the tone of your voice. But these sort of passive things are, I think, very helpful. And what's more, in the HIV community, and we talked about how community benefit, social benefit is an important thing, I think, to drive acceptance. We're seeing and getting feedback from patients saying actually they would like to have a peer that they monitor anonymously and similarly be monitored so that the peer group can pick up people who are wobbling and encourage them to go into care and seek help. So there's a kind of an additional, that kind of social economy where other patients constructively help other people in the digital world, I think has a role in our clinical area.
Just pick up a point, Lizzie, about passive monitoring to continuous monitoring. I think as invisible tech gives us continuous heart rate monitoring, position, motion, galvanic skin response, we are into a frequent observation space that needs to push back into the discovery side of pharma and not just be in post-marketing and in development. If I've got, say, an underlying inflammatory response that goes like this versus one that goes like this, it's likely to be a different biological endotype. This is completely invisible to the clinic at the moment, but through more frequently observed data from continuous monitoring, invisible tech, you will be able to discern with the proper analytic those different subgroups of rhythmicity. Tapping into the rhythms of our daily living and our physiology is fundamental to understanding the interaction of biology, behavior, and environment. And this is really a big discovery horizon.
I think just to build on that, I think there's also a clinical development horizon to it, which is, there are, in most chronic conditions, there are very few trials where the placebo arm doesn't do better than what we believed would happen from real-world evidence collected before, which is generally because people are better looked after in clinical trials than they are generally. And so actually being able to work with patients who want to be part of research and be able to actually characterise their true response to a therapy in the future is actually going to lead to far better decision making about which therapies to take through clinical development and will become products. So much more effective products actually reaching the market because of higher quality, real-time continuous monitoring data from patients.
That's really interesting. One of the other barriers to connected healthcare is you need to look outside your organisation, and often that requires demonstrating value or getting investment in something where there isn't necessarily a causal link to the return. And it's a real challenge for us as a payor, and we're always looking to our colleagues, our pharma colleagues, for things that are beyond the pill, for prices that include services outside of just the medication. And we are seeing that, and I guess that's why this conference and these sorts of discussions are continuing to happen. But I think, it'd be interesting to hear from the panel what challenges you face in terms of getting investment for these types of initiatives, where it's hard to demonstrate the value as clearly as it is when you sell a product, a pill or whatever. And maybe Matt, you could comment on that, because I know we had a discussion about it.
Well, I've been made to feel really good because Tom pointed out that we'd been there for 4 years, which was longer than the average of an innovation group in a pharma company, because they've usually failed and been shut down by that point. So we've
Much better than the average.
So we're better than the average at least, and that's probably just because we fly under the radar. I think what's very interesting is that you're so I think it's where you go and look for the investment within a company like ours. So you have a marketing company who needs a return on any investment within 3 months. You have a brand team who needs a return on investment within a year. And there's some really good stuff that you can do and deliver a return on that. But if that's all you ever do, you'll never actually truly make the kind of breakthroughs that, that Ian's talking about as an example. And so I think you have to understand really clearly what those individual pieces are going to deliver and will become just ways of working and give you a capability to do stuff. And you have to identify the things that are going to take longer to deliver results. And it's a completely different conversation with a different part of the organisation that's about either the scientific community within the organisation or the people from a corporate perspective tasked with looking really to the future. And I think Tom's organisation exists because of people having that kind of vision. Yeah. So I think that's important. I think it's also really important that you can really sell use cases for things very, very well. So it's interesting that both Ian and Tom have talked about technologies that either existed or actually didn't exist 5 years ago that are being used to do very specific things for patients. And I think that's really, really important, that it's not just, hey, look at this cool piece of technology. It's coming the other way and saying, there's an unmet need here. What's the most appropriate technology? What's the most appropriate solution to that unmet need? And if it's a piece of technology that's cutting edge and really, really sexy, fantastic. If it's a card that somebody sticks on their fridge with a fridge magnet, equally fantastic. It has to deliver the unmet need.
Certainly. There's some really important lessons, I think, there from the Connected Health Cities program. It completely resonates that. You pull through of data analytic technology from problem solving. And we tried to answer the question, what is the diameter of trust? And what is the diameter of innovation, benefit? When you go too big, like All England, and you get something that fails dramatically like care.data, because you don't have a cohesive community. And you go too small, and you can't afford to build an infrastructure for every community like that. It just doesn't scale. So the diameter of population coverage for a health system has to be big enough to have economy of scale, small enough to understand the benefits for that community, and invite people in to be part of a supply chain that's pulling through data, analytic, and technology to deliver complex benefits in that chain. And the interesting learning from Connected Health Cities, which is to have pilots of 4 of those populations of 2 to 5 million size across North England, was to par things right down to choosing 2 care pathways per region. So look at the data that flow across your organizations and select just 2. Now, one region came up with 40 different care pathways it wanted to target. But don't tell us about databases, don't tell us about technologies, just pick 2 pathways. For example, stroke, right from the analytic that's looking at stroke mimic, through to triage, through acute, into the right care quickly, through to the big area of problem where things at discharge, antihypertensive medication, anticoagulant medication. There's so many strokes which should never come back into A&E, but they exist because of poor care, of primary care after discharge. Now, when you start looking at a whole system, it's very much easier to put the benefit case. But within that system, there might be 7,000 different databases that you have to join together. There is no one national formula for doing that. Each system must start with a pathway and a problem and a set of standards, but really pull the solution, compose the data analytics and technologies to fit its needs.
And one of the key learnings from connected healthcare from me was that looking at too large a data set, so in UK or European country population size, is too big to get meaningful insights. So you get very high level insights that aren't necessarily useful for designing new care pathways. And what Connected Cities shows is that actually you get much more meaningful insights from smaller data sets, so populations of 2 to 5 million. And actually I've recently been out in Israel with Clalit, which is a accountable care organisation there. And they've only got 5 health insurers that cover the whole of Israel. And they have amazing data and amazing insights and some really good examples of how they're using that data to stop people from coming into hospital and to work with pharmaceutical companies. And their populations are very similar size. Nicola, what were you going to chip in?
Yeah, I think there is a huge value in starting at a local level and that sort of smaller populations. I think that really helps with the trust. But the key thing is to make sure you can then learn from best practice at a local level and scale up and integrate. Because I think there's a danger if you choose your standards in each local area that you then don't have an interoperable system. And I think there is a value of having a national level data set or being able to pull the data from local level initiatives to look at it nationally, that there is an importance of the much larger population, that there's one aspect where the 5 million is about the right size for some questions. For other questions, I think you really need a population of the size of England, and that's where we have real USP in England, is that we have cradle to grave records of a very, very diverse population, and you don't get the diversity necessarily in that 5 million depending what country you're looking at. So rare diseases, for example, it's really important to have a larger population. Or if you're looking at cancer registries, they've been able to get a huge amount of information because it's a larger population that they're drawing from.
It's a key point. So to get the best of both worlds,
Yep.
you want to move from the low-resolution national data sets to a federation of well-characterized populations where you can exploit the heterogeneity of populations, settings, and observation environments to do much better, bigger science, but to have a framework that feeds something back and is being pulled by those communities.
So I've been a bad chair and I've only left a few minutes for questions, but I was wondering if anyone wanted to ask the panel a question. One of the other things I was going to talk about was about how we foster a culture of innovation. In order to be more connected, we need to have attitudes that go beyond the boundaries of our organisations. And so if anyone's got any comments on that, that would be great. Is there a microphone in the room? Oh, well, that'll do.
One of the areas that feels most in need of national into international collaboration on this is not the interoperability piece, which I know is, for instance, the Genomes and Health Initiative, but around outcomes. There's huge amounts of variation in outcomes. It's the easiest way to motivate clinicians to engage in data is to feed it back to them about how their outcomes vary. And I wondered if as a panel you could comment on how we better drive that outcomes initiatives into this estate and more broadly into the world's estate. Because only in interoperability of outcomes I can solve as an IT person for most of the interoperability of systems issues. But if we're not measuring apples to apples, and one person's definition of quality of care is different from another person's, I will never be able to make that giant microscope that can study human health.
Yes. I couldn't agree with you more. We have an army of irritated clinicians out there being beaten up by managers. You just look at NHS Atlas of Variation, and you see crude targets and straplines of iron out variation. If the sum total of medical evidence predicts less than a third of the average outcome of the average patient for the average treatment, then it's ridiculous to try and iron out variation. We must explain it. And this audience knows very well, trying to explain drug outcome variation, different indications, prescribing, proper case mix adjustment, incredibly hard. when you're comparing different independent groups. But systems themselves, with quality management, are trying to do pretty much the same analytic with a very large overlap in the data. So providing those systems with some feedback on the better analytic that we are trying to address in drug outcomes on the one hand, for clinical quality management on the other, I think will then inform the conversation about the economics for those systems and value-based pricing and paying for better outcomes. But the uncertainties there are very much larger than many of the managers I encounter think of.
I think it's also about which outcomes one's looking at and getting ones that are of relevance to the clinician and that they feel are of benefit either to them or their patient. I think if we try and sell this on the basis of league tables and how people are ranked, it's not going to be effective. It needs to be things that have real clinical benefit if we're going to get healthcare professionals to buy into the system. But then the benefit of doing that is that if they get why the data is important, you then improve the quality of the data going in, because the outputs are only as good as what goes in, and that's still up for grabs at the moment.
The tension that we have as a payer is, we have a network of 23,000 clinicians in the UK, and the outcomes that we have on them are not necessarily the sorts of things that our customers are interested in when they make a decision about where they want to go to have their hospital intervention. And our data shows that what our customers want to know is actually quite trivial information around not even things as complex as a mortality rate. They want to know, is this a Bupa recommended doctor, and do they work in a kind of hospital where the staff are safe, the staff are nice, it's safe, etc., the environmental things. So we have a real tension within our organisation. We've got lots of clinical data that gives us understanding about variation in practice. Which actually, to pick up on your point about the Atlas of Variation, we have a partnership with the Dartmouth Trust, and we're looking at variation across our networks. And what we really see is that actually meaningful variation only exists in a very small number of interventions, highly complex interventions, and that the other type of variation is actually not as meaningful for us as a payer. But I think it's a real tension. What outcomes should we collect, both to manage our network, but also to provide our customers so they can make proper informed choices? So I think we are actually out of time, unless there's any other questions. Well, thank you very much, and thank you to my panel. Brilliant discussion.